Imagine that you're trying to choose between two different schools to send your child to. One school requires uniforms, and the other school does not require uniforms. Do you know which school you would choose? Schools should not require students to wear uniforms because they force students into social castes, interfere with their patriotic rights, have no effect on controlling violence and improving performance, and delays a student's transition into adulthood. Students have an instinct to find some way to separate themselves into groups. According to the procon.org site for school uniforms, students will find some other thing to separate themselves by and to distract them from their studies. For example, students who don't have this cool new phone or that new laptop. Lower income families will not be able to afford as many uniforms, so the wear in the clothing will be more obvious to their causing students to also separate into classes. Procon.org also states that proponents for school uniforms claim that children are still able to express their feelings in words. But how many times have you seen a child go to detention for speaking out against something? Schools do not have free speech. If a school enforces uniforms, they are taking away all forms of individuality. Seattle PI also feels that school uniforms encourage all children to be the same and to not have different opinions and thoughts. School uniforms also prevent the opportunity to show support for different causes. According to procon.org, 75 students at Friendly High School in Prince George's County, Maryland, received in-school suspension for wearing pink to support breast cancer awareness in October of 2013. It's ineffective for students learning to put them in detention for not wearing the proper clothing. Tom Houlihan, former superintendent of schools in Oxford, North Carolina, even agreed that school uniforms are, quote, a distraction from focusing on systematic and fundamental transformation to improve our schools. The focus should be on teaching better and helping students understand things, not handing out detentions for not wearing the proper clothing. Here in America, we have a right to free education. Children can go to any public school for free, well, paid for by our tax dollars. When a public school requires students to wear uniforms, free education is no longer free. Procon.org explains that parents still have to buy other clothing for children for the days that they don't have school. So it really doesn't save them money to buy uniforms because that's not the only clothing they need. It's been found that school uniforms can also be quite expensive, whereas you can buy regular nice clothing elsewhere for cheaper. According to greatereducation.org, parents spend an average of $249 a year on school uniforms. Add that to the money spent on regular clothes for the weekend, summer break, winter break, spring break, etc., and you're probably spending $400 a year just on clothing. Procon.org said that some children in York County, Pennsylvania were missing school in September of 2014 simply due to the fact that their parents could not afford to buy the uniforms. How good is that for students' education if they can't even afford to wear the proper clothing just to go to school? Procon.org also makes the argument that the government should not be able to control what our children wear. Parents should be in charge of children, and the government has been trying to take little parts of that away from us parents. Studies have shown that violence has increased with changes in school uniform policy. According to procon.org, there is one often quoted study which showed a decrease in violence, but there were other changes in security measures that could have contributed to the decrease in violence. Dr. Alan Hilfer, a child psychologist, confirms that when school uniforms show a decrease in violence, those schools are also focusing on teaching awareness about violence and bullying. You may be wondering, how are there multiple studies showing the opposite things? Interestingly enough, school uniforms are a booming business that many businesses are dependent on. Lands' End, a company which sells school uniforms, partly funded multiple studies to promote the effectiveness of school uniforms. David Brunsma, PhD and professor of sociology at Virginia Tech, said that at least one of those studies is, quote, so wholly flawed as to render itself useless. According to the Seattle PI education site, school uniforms may decrease gang violence, but there are often strains between students of two different schools simply because they wear different clothing. They also say that school uniforms cause an increased burden on administrators and disciplinarians because they are focusing on enforcing school uniforms when they should be focusing on more important things. In 1999, Texas Southern University did a study which found a 12% increase in incidents requiring discipline once uniforms were introduced. David Brunsma found in a national study of 10th graders that there was no effect on school attendance, violence, substance use, school pride, academic preparedness, or attitudes about school. He actually found a negative effect on academic achievement. They also found that it didn't matter if a kid was in high school, middle school, or elementary school. The results were the same. Lastly, school uniforms slow down a child's transition into adulthood. Developmental psychologist Erik Erikson said that adolescents see clothing as a means of identification, and seeking identification is one of the most important parts of adolescent growth. Procon.org also explains that adults choose their own clothing and can show their individuality, but if a child wears a school uniform every day, they don't get the practice that they need in choosing their own outfits. There are many things in society that we are not allowing children to do, which are setting them back in the process of growing up. Would you want to help your child make clothing decisions up until they're 20 plus years old and possibly raising children of their own? I wouldn't. I would want them to be more independent so that I can move on with my empty nester life. Obviously, mandatory uniforms are not in the best interest of anyone, not the students, parents, principal, or disciplinarian. The best option is to keep children educated about how violence and bullying affects others. Give them motivation through love and teaching, and you will see that violence will go down and academic achievements will go up. If each of you just stood against school uniforms when the topic comes up in the PTA or any other parent-involving meetings, we could show the world that school uniforms are not in the best interest of anyone.